Hi everyone and welcome to my presentation today. I'm Dr. Lynette Pretorius from Monash University, and today I'm going to talk to you about writing groups, reflective learning and psychological capital in the PhD. So as we start today's presentation, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, which I recognize today is all over the world. So I am coming to you today from the lands of the Bunurong people, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I also encourage you to recognize the traditional owners of the lands on which you are joining us from today. So here I can see a picture of what most people understand the PhD to be like. You can see the student following the supervisor along, and as they go through that process, they eventually gain the disciplinary knowledge necessary for them to get the title of doctor in front of their name. And this is common pedagogical practice in many places around the world. However, the lived experience for a PhD student is often quite different and is linked very closely to their writing. So here you can see the student getting up, very excited to go to their studies, getting there and then getting stuck because of the writing that they have to do. And this disconnect between the pedagogical practice and the lived experience for students can cause quite a bit of challenge for the students as they go through their journeys. And here you can see one participant from one of my studies talking about how the PhD is hard. And this is because there are problems with the technical disciplinary knowledge that's been taught, but also the soft skills that are necessary, that there's lots of deadlines, and this leads to a lot of stress for students during their studies. So a PhD student generally is considered to become a graduate when they have gained their disciplinary knowledge to demonstrate that they have made a unique contribution to the field. And this is where the pedagogical practice is often focused for a PhD student. However, there is a lot of other things that happens during a PhD student's candidature. And this is related to that lived experience I talked about before, because it's quite important to develop a whole range of transferable skills, such as academic writing, but also many other things like project management, networking, all those sorts of skills. So a student also does undergo quite a significant amount of personal growth, and they develop their sense of academic identity through the process of doing their research. And it is also clear that doing a PhD necessitates someone to navigate the often very tacit and complex academic processes that are around for them to eventually succeed in an academic context. And one of the biggest things that students focus on, but is also a necessary metric for success for students, is their academic writing. And this is because academic writing is how they communicate their research in the end. So academic writing is a form of identity work for these people and also for us who work in academia longer term. This is where we share our work and engage in that disciplinary community. This is where we develop our own voice and how we develop a sense of confidence in the academic arguments we are making. However, this necessitates quite a bit of emotional investment because you are writing yourself into the communication that you are making about your research. And consequently, there is quite a bit of research out there now demonstrating that students experience significant writing anxiety. And this is not just anxiety for the final dissertation, but it is related to all parts of the academic writing process, which can be quite debilitating at times. Additionally, it can lead to the manifestation of imposter phenomenon, where students feel like they are frauds, they are maybe not worthy of being a PhD student. And you can see here's a participant from a study, Lindsay, who talks about the fact that not being able to communicate in academic writing the way that was expected, and constantly making what she perceived to be mistakes and not knowing how to fix this, helped her to feel like she was not really a worthwhile scholar. It was taxing and difficult, but it was also very challenging for her sense of self and self-worth. And here you can see Melissa, which clearly demonstrates an example of imposter phenomenon, where because of the challenges she was facing with her academic writing, she started thinking that maybe she didn't have the qualifications needed to be a PhD student, and eventually to the point where she now sometimes thinks that she's the dumbest PhD student ever. Given these things, it is clear that there is pedagogical innovation needed to help students develop the skills they need to succeed in whatever field they choose to do their research, as well as whatever they choose to do afterwards. There is also a significant sense of isolation in the PhD. So this is because the PhD is traditionally a rather isolated endeavor, where a student tends to be with maybe one or two other students and their supervisors, and don't really connect more broadly with the university context. And this is why the student-supervisor relationship is quite important. And there's a lot of research out there demonstrating the impact of the student-supervisor relationship on students' ability to succeed and progress in their careers. However, given that it is so isolated, it is important to acknowledge that there are many other places around that students can and should get some support. So research demonstrates that a variety of support from other sources is important, including those from peers, other staff members, and professional networks in the discipline. Also, there is a lot of research just generally in education that demonstrates that having a sense of connection and a sense of friendship is important for student well-being as well as student satisfaction. So what I like to do is I try and find out whether the writing groups can be a site for pedagogical innovation, which addresses both the writing anxiety that we were talking about before, but also this lack of connection between participants. So there's a lot of research out there now that demonstrates the benefits of academic writing groups. So in particular, in terms of the academic writing skills. So you can see here that there's research that demonstrates doctoral writing groups helps to increase written output and increase confidence while also decreasing anxiety. It also makes people more accountable for their choice of and style in their writing. And it helps them develop analytical and organizational skills, which helps them present more cohesive arguments. And this happens through various types of reflection throughout the process. The research clearly demonstrates that the benefits of doctoral writing groups occur within the dialogic feedback process that happens within writing groups, where feedback is discussed and explained, and therefore the students who have gotten feedback on their writing, as well as the students who have heard the feedback for someone else, all learn together in that process. And through this dialogic peer feedback process, the writing as a form of communication becomes a social practice where people start to write for an audience. They start thinking beyond just how can I say this particular discipline content to how can I communicate this to my reader. And so here you can see examples of some of my writing groups where we sit together, read some text, provide some feedback, and discuss that feedback. Now, prior to the pandemic, these photos were taken, and you would see we are sitting in a cafe. We're all reading the documents together. Then afterwards, we discuss the feedback. Sometimes we also have visitors, like one of the students' sons there. And I reckon the student sitting there, or the son sitting there looking at the computer, is how it is working now, post-pandemic, because now they are hybrid. They run both online and in person at the same time, where we have our computers and we read documents together through Google Docs and provide feedback and discuss them with our headphones sitting next to each other in the cafe. An important part of my writing groups, though, is that we don't just do writing. We also connect to that more social space that was important to help build that connection and sense of belonging. So here you can see some photos of that. So the top two photos are representative of some end of year celebrations that we were having. And the one at the bottom right, you can see we also celebrate successes and achievements of students. So here, one of the students was graduating. And so we had a little party where the student could celebrate their success. And this is important because it builds that sense of community among the participants. Now, through my research, I have found that in general, students tend to join a writing group because they are trying to improve particular professional skills, mostly academic writing, because they consider that as necessary for them to communicate their research in the end. And through the process of being part of the writing group, the academic care that is provided in these settings helps to build confidence and foster a perceived sense of self-efficacy that they can succeed. However, importantly, students tend to persist in the writing group because of the affective benefits that they discover. Through the writing group and the way that it is run, participants feel valued, encouraged, guided, and supported. And in this way, it engenders trust and reciprocity within the writing group, but it also builds resilience and it encourages people to persist in their studies towards success. During the process, there is a lot of reflective practice that happens as you get feedback on your own writing, thinking about how you can do that better, why did you do something in that way, but also the more general discussions we have about how are things going, what are some problems, how can we solve that. In this way, they start to develop their sense of academic identity because it starts to encourage self-awareness and then inspires autonomy and problem solving. And in this way, the student understands themselves better and starts to become part of academia because they start working with the peers in their group and the facilitator to navigate the norms and expectations of academia. And in this way, they build social capital in academia, and it fosters empowerment because they feel like they are competent within the field they found themselves. So there's actually a lot more benefits than just the academic writing side of doctoral writing groups. There's a lot of affective benefits that are really important in successful writing group settings. And our research has shown that in this writing group setting, if it's run well, there is a space of security that's created. In this space, there are shared stories, shared experiences about whatever is happening along the journey. And in a space that is inclusive and allows that to happen, participants can get emotional support from each other. Additionally, they develop a sense of networking and collegiality because they get to know people that they would not normally have seen otherwise. And this actually does quite often lead to the development of friendships that persist well after their PhD is finished. Indeed, I have some students who used to be part of the writing group and now organized to attend the same conferences so that they can catch up with each other again across the world. And here you can see one participant in our research who talks about these affective benefits of the writing groups, particularly that they feel that they are not alone, that they have friendship, that there is this connection between people. It provides that support you need to encourage you to stay studying in your journey, particularly given that the PhD is quite a challenging journey. Now, at this point, I'd like to provide a content warning that the second half of this presentation focuses more in depth about these emotions and feelings, and as a result, we'll be talking about mental illness. So this is a content warning to understand that we will be talking about quite significant anxiety and depression data that is out there about the experiences of PhD students. So there is now a well-established body of research that has highlighted that there is an academic mental health crisis. And this is for PhD students, as well as later on, it persists in academia longer term. The data is quite stark. The most seminal study, I would say, is Levecki's and colleagues' study in 2017 of quite a substantial cohort of participants, showing that 51% of the PhD students in their study experienced psychological distress. A year later, there was an even bigger study, which found that the prevalence of anxiety was 41% of participants and 39% for depression. Perhaps the most stark and depressing statistics is the one from Barreira in 2018, who talked about the fact that the prevalence of anxiety and depression was similar to those of incarcerated populations, highlighting that the mental health landscape is particularly bad for PhD students. And in my most recent study, I found that 69% of my participants experienced psychological distress, with 45% of them experiencing significant distress and requiring referral to rather immediate mental health support. And so this sparked my interest in understanding what happens to help people move through that experience that clearly is quite detrimental to your mental health. What is it that helps them succeed? And therefore, what can I do as an educator to create an environment where I can support students to navigate this very dire situation? And so I conducted a study on a particular case in my participant group called M. M was at the end of her second year during my data collection of her 3-year studies. She had started quite well in her project, and you can see here, even before she started her project, she felt she was happy, she was content and purpose-driven, and she started her PhD because she wanted to improve the experiences of children in her context. She had a very strong intrinsic motivation to do this project. She wanted to make a situation better for others. However, during her studies, she discovered that actually she was quite unwell. So you can see here, she starts the PhD and she was all happy, but then over time, it has become much more challenging. And you can see here, she explains it as being a tiny little boat in a fierce and intimidating ocean that is wildly stormy. And so when she discusses her experiences, she notes that the challenge was starting to happen after she had finished her data collection. So she collected her data overseas, she came back and she started experiencing quite significant physical symptoms, which turned out to be panic attacks. And these were actually quite debilitating for her. Additionally, she was very ashamed. She felt like she was weak, that others were judging her, or that they would blame her because she didn't take care of herself somewhere along the way, and so it was kind of her own fault. And this caused her a lot of stress during her studies, and so much so that she considered quitting her PhD. And you can see there she was miserable, frustrated, and she says she was quite lost. Now, it's quite interesting at this point in time to think that, how did she manage to continue? Because M has since graduated, successfully completed her studies, and is now working in the field that she wanted to work in. So how did she get from this point where she was miserable, frustrated, and lost to that point? That's what I really wanted to know in my study. And you can see here, she said that she was literally afraid of dropping dead because she was studying too much. And she highlights that the reason for this, she realizes now, is because she made the PhD her whole existence. It becomes your whole world. It is the only thing that matters. But then she realized, she had this light bulb moment that if she was dead, she would not be able to finish her PhD. And that therefore she needed to do something, because it's not worth her life, because there's so much more to life than this. So she had this spark of insight, and through that managed to work towards improving her situation. So how did she get this spark? Well, I would say that this is a combination of many things that I explore in my paper, but certainly one of the most important things was she actually realized she was unwell because she felt like she was dying, and then actively went to seek support. She had learned about the psychological support that was available at our university, and consequently, through being aware and understanding through the discussions that we had had previously, that it was okay to seek help, she made that first contact with a mental health professional. And through this experience, she learned a lot about herself. And then she realized that actually, I need to take a conscious step. I need to make a specific effort to do something about it. And here you can see she talks about that. She says, I came around and I remembered I needed to have compassion with myself. And I needed to stop worrying about what other people would think. I had to make the decision to either quit or to continue on. So she had to make a cognitive switch to prioritize her self-care, in her words. And so how did she do that? Well, with the help of her mental health support, as well as her very supportive supervisors and her friends, she mapped out everything that she was doing, why she was doing the PhD, why it mattered to her. And she reconnected with that initial intrinsic motivation she had. She was really interested to complete because she still had this curiosity, this hope and optimism for that she would be able to improve the children in her context experiences. And in this way, even though it was quite challenging, it was very painful, she had to work through a lot of things and there was a lot of trial and error, she learned to master the skills she needed. And in this way, you can see she says it helped her to stabilize the boat in this stormy ocean and sail towards her destination. So I consider her story to represent what is known as psychological capital. And you can see the definition here on the screen, where psychological capital is when someone has the confidence or efficacy to take on the necessary effort for these challenging tasks. They have optimism about succeeding. They have hope that they can succeed, and that when they do encounter challenges, they have developed the resilience to bounce back or maybe even go beyond what they had experienced to attain their success. So psychological capital is a combination of efficacy, optimism, hope, and resilience. And to me, this fostering of this psychological capital provides a way in which we as educators can help improve the PhD mental health landscape, because it is quite a complex situation. It is not that there's just a switch that can be fixed. There are a lot of different things that need to change. And these things will take time for academia more broadly to become a more welcoming space. However, this does not mean that we should just leave the students to try and navigate the space, because that's not our job as educators. Our job as educators is to help them succeed and reach their goals. And so if we can develop a pedagogical practice where we can help students navigate this can be very helpful for them. And so how can we do this? Now, there are many ways, but through my research, I have found the following things to be particularly helpful. Firstly, it is essential for us as educators, as research supervisors, and even as peers to model this sense of efficacy, optimism, hope, and resilience. And we do this through sharing our own journeys. It is important to realize that often students only see end products. They see the published paper, they see the conference presentation, but they don't see the journey that the academic went through before they got there. Sharing those working drafts of things helps them to see how we navigate when there's mistakes made, failure, when our paper is rejected, what do we do? So it's important for us to also have open discussions about mental health. And this, like I showed you before, we do quite often in our writing groups, but also with our students, you should, when you are having those supervisor meetings, we should talk about the fact that we should encourage self-compassion. We should have a growth mindset in the way that we approach things. It is important to reduce stigma, because there is still a significant amount of stigma attached to mental illness. And in particular, there is stigma for PhD students in actually seeking mental health support. My research shows that most students in my cohort were aware that the support was available, but actually most of them didn't think that they would actually use that support. So that we need to reduce the stigma associated with that it is okay to go and seek mental health support because it's part of us taking care of ourselves. It's also important to remember and to challenge the perception that still exists out there in academia that, you know, I survived my PhD, so therefore you should be able to survive your PhD, just figure it out. We need to remember that just experiencing adversity does not mean you just magically develop psychological capital. Similarly, the same experience can be very differently perceived by different people. So we should not just expect people to figure it out for themselves. We should not ignore the problems or adversity that exist within the academic context, and there are many. Instead, we should help students to learn how to interpret these obstacles as potential opportunities for learning, figuring out how to navigate these challenges into their future. And as I said before, sharing both our successes and our failures with students are very important so that they don't feel like they are this imposter because they don't always succeed like they think their supervisors, for example, do. It's also important, and I reckon actually essential, to embed reflective learning for both students and supervisors in the PhD. And there are many ways you can do this, but I quite often encourage students to think firstly about why you started your PhD. Why is it important to you? How have you gotten to the point where you are that this is something that you'd like to investigate? Now, in qualitative research, this is quite important in terms of positioning the researcher within the research. And this is also part of reflexivity later during data collection and analysis, for example. But it's also important in other disciplines. It's important for you as a person to be self-aware of who you are. And this is also true for supervisors. So in my research paper about Em, it is actually a narrative ethnography where I tell her story, but I interweave her story with my story. And in this way, both of us discover more about ourselves and how we can improve into the future. Additionally, I highly recommend embedding collaborative and experiential learning practices. So in my case, I do this through the writing groups where we work together. For example, we have done several papers that we have written together as the writing group. And in this way, you develop that sense of collegiality and working together in teams and so forth, but also you develop a sense of competence that you can succeed in this discipline because you've managed to actually write a paper, get it published, work on a project together, that sort of thing. And through this experiential learning where you're learning through the practice of doing and you're guided by someone to help you achieve success, you develop that sense of self-efficacy that is needed to succeed. And I truly believe that by doing these things, we as educators can make the academic environment more welcoming, compassionate, inclusive, and growth-focused. And here you can see a photo of me with some of my writing group students as we are having a very open discussion. The entire meeting was purposely there to talk about mental health because it was for Are You OK Day, which is a event that happens in Australia for suicide awareness. And here you can see we are having yellow colored food because that's the theme of the color of the event. But also we have discussions there in this meeting to talk about, you know, what is it that is problematic in academia? How does it affect people? What can we do when we do experience difficulties? So now we have time for questions, and if anyone is interested, I do have the references on my slides that I've used throughout today's session that you can access later. So are there any questions? Thank you.